Let's take a step back here and look at the bigger picture of how art began to change up to and during the early 20th century. Into the mid to late 19th century, the Impressionists broke away from nostalgic romanticism and naturalism, itself moulded through an ever-decreasing tradition for commissioned work in the decades preceding. Impressionist ideas were formed around a desire to go further into the realms of method, as commissioned subjects increasingly became irrelevant. How to paint, what was actually seen rather than what the artist knew to be seen. Hence the preoccupation with method of seeing and its results in terms of light and colour. An example of this line of thinking could be taken from Whistler's painting of his mother, which was about the subject, but he chose to name it Arrangement in Grey and Black, distancing the work from subject matter in 1871 by way of title. The subject was paramount in commissioned work, and for the Impressionists, seeing what they saw was to them not only showing what the artist saw in that moment, as also a break with the tradition of rules about subject. What subject was considered to be picturesque, how a painting would be composed. Moreover, it was by them considered a new or scientific way of seeing. The Impressionists varied in their painterly approach, but all had paid a new attention to how light fell on the subject. This was primarily because the subjects were outdoors, dealing away with the formal rules of light and shading which could be traced back to sfumato in the Renaissance, whereby a face, for example, would be gradated in shade to give form, much like Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Manet's The Balcony shows how this was done when we realises the faces do not have shade. They appear flat as the light falls directly onto the surface. The only need is for an indication of shape, a single brushstroke, no more. Other Impressionists such as Monet take this further into combinations of single brushstrokes, showing reflected light in shade. And in what is known as Neo-Impressionism, Seurat and Signac take an approach characterised by the use of the divisionist technique, based on a scientific theory on optical colour, doing away with line of form and conjuring the whole by means of individual dots of colour, often popularly but incorrectly called pointillism, a term Paul Signac repudiated. The post-impressionists went further as they saw certain aspects missing, such as solidity and depth. And widely, the subject having been the purpose of so many paintings and sculptures for hundreds of years, now took a different shift. Cézanne, a man with means of self-support, battled doggedly far away from the fray of modernism's rift with tradition. He trying to find solidity in form again, yet without losing intensity of light or depth of what he saw. His outdoor landscapes and still lives began to be made up or constructed of shapes, seeing an object as a cylinder or square or sphere. He was in hindsight to become a precursor to proto-cubism and cubism itself. Van Gogh, another loner with what could now be said to be probable bipolar affecting his daily life and how he saw it, painted with a desire to show what he wanted to convey about the atmosphere of his subject through colour, an early form of expressionism. And Gauguin, an ill-suited gregarious friend of Van Gogh's, left France to study the purity of form and culture, with flattened human form and vast blocks of colour in what he saw in Tahitians and their traditions, far away from the schism of artistic thought surrounding modernism which was battling out in Paris. Artists sought to find new solutions to showing form, and with the legacy of Courbet and Corot and the Barbizon school's new approach to subject matter during the 1850s, with real life unprettified, importantly with its own unique dignity, peasants and workers now shown in this light rather than ridiculed for humorous delectation, this opposed to the staged subjects or history painting of earlier times. Now, with a preoccupation in how to show form coming first, subject was not necessarily as important, certainly not as important as being required to paint a commissioned portrait, for example. A restriction of expression had been lifted, and a whole new set of conundrums of expression had been opened up. So, although not depicting a historically specific event, Turner's Rain, Steam and Speed was telling us something about the events that were unfolding, by unfolding them in his approach to painting. Change was occurring globally at the turn of the 20th century, but it was at its most heightened in Europe and the US, affecting psyche. The turn of the 20th century was very much about out with the old and in with the new. The main hangers-on, the Habsburg monarchy, for whom it was now only a matter of time before a tipping point, a spectacular demise, catapulting all of Europe, Russia and then America into World War I. For the UK, this had its roots in pre-Protestant Reformation, as there were Catholic tastes in abundance. Immediately post-Reformation, there were none. Religious destruction akin to nuclear wasteland, art's ability to relay religious message had been struck down. This was replaced with fear of its Catholic return and fear of yet another devastation and trauma. Yet the collective psyche harked back to its pre-Reformation and Gothic past, a mourning of that past. Peculiar to Britain, this went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution and a relentless speed of change, both economically and socially within society. And a very Victorian phenomenon emerged, in that of institutions. They were set up to house the poor, the orphaned, the mentally unstable, and a society still at odds with itself, even with the by now relatively homogenised English churches, with the now accepted Catholic Church, a very English Anglican Church, and many diversified Protestant beliefs stemming from Lutheranism and Calvinism, all believing in differing but similar core values, kind of rubbing along, and certainly compared with previous centuries post-Reformation. Two views on faith, however, still being the main divider. The Catholic faith believing in transubstantiation, meaning Christ being present during the sacraments, Christ's presence delivered to each individual in the congregation via the appointed priest. Anglican and Protestant beliefs differing in that any reference to Christ during the sacraments would be purely a memory of him, as it would not be possible for him to be present. And importantly, there is no need of any mediator between Christ and the faithful on earth in the Protestant Church. The only thing required is to have that faith and be answerable to God, a one-to-one approach. And salvation is also seen differently, dividing ideas, as the Catholic faith requires a mediator and confession to reach personal salvation, whereas Protestant only requires that personal faith, again, the one-to-one. And with the old and exploited Catholic idea of reward on earth for good deeds done having long been quashed, any altruistic motive to be mindful of the poor, the destitute, the needy, whichever faith, was a very personal affair in the 1800s. So, although not a recipe for an uncaring society, good deeds were more on the lines of lock 'em away, forget, job done. And aside from splintering religious beliefs, the differing views on society as a whole could be found in Marxist thinking on surplus profit causing inequality in capitalism, and Nietzsche on Übermensch and master and slave morality, differing moral values at odds with each other. Master morality values pride and power, while slave morality values things like kindness, empathy and sympathy. So, with all this going on, if St. Francis's self-purging, caring ethic was born out of Catholic tastes in personal vindication, and the Protestant and Anglican equivalent was equally humble, the agnostic ideas about society in terms of delivering charity was equally diverse. However, the UK probably had, deep in its psyche, a morbid fascination towards those Catholic tastes of old, which during the 1800s played out in an emergence of new fictional fashion, an appetite for science-laden horror stories, think Frankenstein, with storylines asking the reader to confront those fears and fascination by proxy, uneasy fictional adventures with a side of risk or dare. Great Britain had ventured into colonial territory far bigger than its own, yet this island, with its borders defined by sea, its past seafaring prowess and navy, would help create a psyche steeped in defence and certitude of its past. This was also time of flux between continental Europe, Russia and the US. Shifts in thinking and governing systems, all brought about by rising middle class, a new age of industrial wealth and movement of people. One crucial thing emerged, which was as true now as was ever true in classical history, that of to build an idea of the future that people would accept in order to govern them. And this topsy-turvy reaction to war would help influence Surrealism, Nouveau Realism, and later into 60s pop art and Fluxus, probably creating the first illusion that all art movements were always going to have a de facto influence on any future isms to come, especially in the West. The idea that in order to be strong was easier in groups was no new thing, but that artists notable by their usually solitary works, unless for example grouped in schools such as the schools of Renaissance art, it became more obvious that the singular artist could become more readily recognised and possibly stronger in a group. This recognition would work both ways. It also gave a handy moniker for the newly emerging critics to embrace art and artists into critically driven styles or tick boxes. I will spend a little time here on Dada's influence in the new Republic of Germany post-World War I, the dramatic difference between what had gone before World War I and how the reaction to it would influence. Dadaists were famous for, amongst other things, Marcel Duchamp's urinal, made in the US in 1917. Duchamp really changed the idea of what art could be about, in taking something not made by the artist's hand, such a historical idea. He now took an object and made it an art object, with the simple use of meaning in the context of appropriation. Artists were able to see that possibilities could arise from a concept, or making something out of nothing, or indeed something out of something already made, other than rendering an image. This was to shape the rest of the 20th century in a dramatic way. One of the later movements post-World War II would have a different sort of currency in aiding a new approach to the roles that art had begun to play in post-World War II communism. This directly at odds with industrial capitalism, and especially in the relatively unscathed USA, reeling on the cusp of its own golden age of industrial wealth in post-war production, itself coming out of the never-to-be-forgotten years of the 1930s Great Depression. The US saw an opportunity in some of Japan's radical artists. The Gutai Group, formed in 1954, with their manifesto pledged to always create something new. However, with the Gutai Group, they had a wider idea of strength in numbers that forming a group had, a strange twist, gu meaning measure or tool in Japanese and tai meaning body, gave this post-war art potential for a new direction. They liked the immediacy of performance and connects between time, space and body. It was harnessed and funded by the Americans for post-World War II Western alliance in post-occupation Japan. Abstract expressionism had begun to be taken on board in the States, offering a hugely useful aesthetic to promote, so different from that of socialist realism of communist countries. The Gutai offered a new aesthetic to promote in hands across the sea gestures. All the Axis countries were steered in new directions in art, in antithesis for Japan in particular, with pan-continental exhibitions. The prestigious non-national Solomon Guggenheim International Award Programme was a key in showing the Gutai's work. And so groups or movements in art were given new status, coined by different critics, informed points of view, which resulted in a critical history of 20th century art. Artists' manifestos and groups, whether coined by critics or not, were not new. This happened after the Impressionism and Expressionism of the late 1800s, around the turn of the 20th century and into the turbulent years during and between the two world wars. Resulting in many varied groups, they became synonymous with the era known as modern art, up until a change halfway through the century which would be newly labelled as postmodernism, with no less factions and groups of style emanating up until, well, the next newly coined term. Modern art post-World War II. This happened in America most notably and dramatically as Peggy Guggenheim and MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, would help create something to become known as a scene in now affluent New York. The rise of certain artists were to become beneficial for America politically post-war, and Jackson Pollock and the abstract expressionists were the foot soldiers of that aspect of the West's move into a new kind of art and aesthetic in general.